In the winter of 1942, on the frozen steppes of the Soviet Union, over 300,000 German soldiers found themselves trapped in a deadly pocket around the city of Stalingrad. Their fate hung in the balance, and it would be decided not by superior Soviet tactics, not by the brutal Russian winter, but by a single order from their supreme commander. One order, for words that would seal the doom of an entire army. Stand fast. No retreat. This is the story of how Adolf Hitler's fateful command to hold Stalingrad at all costs transformed what could have been a strategic withdrawal into one of the most catastrophic military disasters in human history. It's a story of hubris, ideology overruling military wisdom, and the terrible price paid by hundreds of thousands of men caught in the machinery of total war. Today, we're diving deep into the Battle of Stalingrad, specifically focusing on the critical moment when retreat was still possible, when survival was still an option, and how one man's refusal to accept reality destroyed the German Sixth Army and changed the course of World War II forever. To understand how this disaster unfolded, we need to go back to the summer of 1942. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun in June 1941 with stunning success. German armies swept across Soviet territory, encircling entire Soviet armies and advancing hundreds of miles. But the grand dream of crushing the Soviet Union in a single campaign had failed. The Red Army, though battered and bleeding, had not collapsed. By the summer of 1942, Hitler was planning his next major offensive. This time, the strategic focus shifted south. The objective was Case Blue, Fall Blau in German, an ambitious campaign to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus. The German war machine was desperately hungry for fuel, and the Soviet oil fields represented both a vital resource to capture and deny to the enemy. But there was another objective on the map, a city on the Volga River, an industrial center bearing the name of Hitler's greatest rival, Stalingrad. Initially, Stalingrad was not the primary objective. It was meant to be a supporting operation, a way to protect the northern flank of the advance into the Caucasus. The city was strategically important because it sat on the Volga River, a major transportation artery for Soviet war materials. Capturing it would sever this vital supply line. But for Hitler, Stalingrad represented something more. The city bore Stalin's name, and capturing it would be a tremendous propaganda victory. For Stalin, defending the city was equally symbolic. He would not allow a city bearing his name to fall without the most desperate resistance. This toxic combination of military objectives and personal prestige would set the stage for one of the war's bloodiest battles. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, was assigned to take Stalingrad. Paulus was a capable and methodical officer, a staff officer by background who had risen through careful planning and attention to detail. He was not the swashbuckling panzer commander type, but a careful, by-the-book general. In August 1942, the Sixth Army began its approach to Stalingrad. What Paulus and his men expected to be a relatively straightforward urban assault would turn into a nightmare that would consume the next 5 months. The battle for Stalingrad began in earnest in late August 1942. On August 23rd, the Luftwaffe conducted one of the most devastating air raids of the entire war. Hundreds of German bombers turned the city into an inferno. Estimates suggest that over 40,000 civilians died in that single day of bombing. The city burned, and massive clouds of black smoke rose into the summer sky. But rather than making the German advance easier, the bombing created the perfect environment for determined defenders. The rubble of destroyed buildings became ready-made fortifications. Every pile of bricks, every collapsed wall, every basement became a potential strongpoint. The German Sixth Army pushed into the city in September, expecting to crush Soviet resistance within days. What they found instead was a kind of warfare they had never experienced before. The Soviets, under the command of General Vasily Chukov, adopted a strategy they called hugging the enemy. They deliberately fought at extremely close quarters, often only meters away from German positions. This neutralized German advantages in artillery and air support. You couldn't call in a bombing run when your own men were mixed in with the enemy in the same building. The fighting became extraordinarily brutal. Battles raged room by room, floor by floor, sometimes for days over a single building. The grain elevator, the barricade factory, the tractor factory, Pavlov's house. These locations became legendary as scenes of desperate, close-quarters combat. German soldiers, trained for mobile warfare across open terrain, found themselves in an urban nightmare. A Soviet soldier could be hiding in a basement, on a rooftop, behind a pile of rubble. The front line became impossible to define clearly. Units became fragmented, isolated, ground down. But slowly, at terrible cost, the Germans made progress. By November, they controlled roughly 90% of the city. German soldiers could see the Volga River, the final objective. Victory seemed tantalizingly close. General Paulus reported to headquarters that with one more push, with fresh reinforcements, Stalingrad would fall completely. But the Germans had become so focused on taking every street, every building, every pile of rubble in Stalingrad that they had failed to notice what was happening around them. While the world's attention was focused on the brutal street fighting in Stalingrad, Soviet military planners were working on something far more ambitious. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, arguably the most talented Soviet commander of the war, had been studying the German positions around Stalingrad, and he had noticed something critical. The German Sixth Army's flanks, stretching for hundreds of miles north and south of the city, were held not by German troops, but by Allied armies. Romanians, Italians, and Hungarians. These Allied armies were poorly equipped compared to their German counterparts. They lacked adequate anti-tank weapons, had inferior training, and their morale was questionable. They had been stationed in quiet sectors because German commanders didn't expect major Soviet attacks there. Zhukov saw an opportunity. If the Soviets could break through these weak flanks north and south of Stalingrad and link up behind the city, they could encircle the entire German Sixth Army. The operation was codenamed Uranus, and it was the most ambitious Soviet military operation of the war so far. Throughout October and early November, the Soviets quietly assembled massive forces north and south of Stalingrad. Over 1 million soldiers, thousands of artillery pieces, and hundreds of tanks were moved into position. The Soviets went to extraordinary lengths to conceal their preparations. Troop movements happened at night. Radio silence was strictly enforced. Deception operations suggested Soviet attacks would come elsewhere. German intelligence noticed some Soviet buildup, but drastically underestimated its scale. German commanders were so fixated on taking the last few blocks of Stalingrad that they dismissed warnings about Soviet preparations as exaggerations. On November 19, 1942, the trap was sprung. At 7:30 a.m., after a massive artillery barrage that shook the frozen earth, Soviet forces smashed into the Romanian Third Army north of Stalingrad. The Romanian lines, already suffering from low morale and inadequate equipment, simply collapsed. Soviet tank columns poured through the gaps, racing south. The next day, November 20th, the southern pincer attacked. Again, the Romanian defenders were quickly overwhelmed. Soviet mobile forces raced northward. On November 23, 1942, just 4 days after the offensive began, the two Soviet pincers met at the town of Kalach, about 50 miles west of Stalingrad. The trap was closed. The German Sixth Army, along with elements of the 4th Panzer Army, approximately 290,000 men, were now completely surrounded. When news of the Soviet breakthrough reached German headquarters, the reaction was shock and confusion. General Paulus immediately understood the gravity of the situation. His army was trapped in Stalingrad with limited supplies. Winter was setting in. His first instinct, shared by many of his officers, was clear: break out immediately while the Soviet encirclement was still relatively weak. The German military had a long tradition of flexible, mobile warfare. When threatened with encirclement, the standard response was to break out, preserve your forces, and regroup. Staying in a pocket was extremely dangerous. History was full of examples of armies that had been encircled and destroyed. General Paulus began planning for a breakout. His plan was to gather his forces, concentrate his armor, and smash through the Soviet lines to the southwest, linking up with German forces still holding positions outside the pocket. It would be difficult and would require abandoning heavy equipment, but it was feasible. On November 22nd, Paulus sent a message to Hitler's headquarters requesting permission to break out of the encirclement. The response he received would seal his army's fate. Hitler, at his headquarters in East Prussia, was initially inclined to refuse permission for a retreat. His military philosophy had always emphasized holding ground at all costs. He believed that retreats were signs of weakness that could cascade into collapse. In his mind, will and determination could overcome material disadvantages. But there was another voice whispering in Hitler's ear. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, made an extraordinary promise. He assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped Sixth Army by air until a relief operation could break through the Soviet encirclement. Göring claimed his aircraft could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day to Stalingrad. This was the minimum amount the Sixth Army needed to survive and maintain combat effectiveness. It was a fantasy. Luftwaffe staff officers immediately recognized it as impossible. The distances were too great, the weather would be terrible, the Soviets would contest every flight, and the Luftwaffe simply didn't have enough transport aircraft for such an operation. Previous, smaller airlift operations had shown how difficult it was to supply encircled forces. But Göring's promise gave Hitler the justification he wanted to refuse Paulus's request. On November 24, 1942, the order came from Hitler's headquarters to the trapped Sixth Army. The army was to form a hedgehog defense, a fortress, and hold its positions. No breakout, no retreat. The army would be supplied by air, and a relief operation would be organized to break through to them. The Sixth Army was ordered to hold Stalingrad at all costs. This was the fatal decision. This was the order that would destroy an entire army. General Paulus, a loyal and obedient officer, received the order with deep misgivings. Many of his subordinate commanders were furious. Some argued for disobeying the order. But Paulus, shaped by a military culture that emphasized obedience and discipline, felt he could not disobey a direct order from the supreme commander. The window for a breakout, while the Soviet encirclement was still relatively weak, would remain open for perhaps another week or two. But with Hitler's order, that window began to close. The Sixth Army settled in to wait for relief that would never come. The Luftwaffe's airlift operation to supply the trapped Sixth Army began almost immediately, and it was a disaster from the start. Göring had promised 500 tons of supplies per day. In reality, the Luftwaffe never came close to delivering this amount. The challenges were enormous. The main airfields available to the Germans, Tatsinskaya and Morozovsk, were over 200 kilometers from the Stalingrad pocket. The available transport aircraft, primarily Junkers, Ju-52s, and Heinkel He-111 bombers pressed into transport service, simply didn't have the capacity. Weather in the Russian winter was brutal. Blizzards grounded aircraft for days at a time. Fog, ice, and snow made flying extremely dangerous. Aircraft engines froze. Runways became unusable. Inside the pocket, the airfields at Potomnik and Gumrak were under constant Soviet artillery fire and air attack. Landing and taking off became gauntlet runs. Many aircraft were destroyed on the ground or shot down approaching or leaving the pocket. Soviet fighters increasingly contested the air. The early period when the Luftwaffe had air superiority was over. Yak and Lag Soviet fighters hunted the slow, vulnerable German transports. On the best days, the Luftwaffe managed to deliver perhaps 200 tons of supplies. On average days, it was closer to 100 tons. On the worst days, when weather grounded all flights, it was zero. The mathematics were brutal. The Sixth Army needed 500 tons per day. They were receiving, on average, less than 120 tons per day. The deficit was slowly killing them. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food rations were cut, then cut again. By December, German soldiers were receiving less than half their normal rations. Hunger became a constant companion. Medical supplies ran critically low. Wounded men died from lack of basic medications. Frostbite cases multiplied as winter temperatures plunged well below zero, and there was insufficient fuel to heat bunkers and shelters. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Artillery shells were rationed. Every bullet became precious, and the Soviets were tightening the noose, launching attacks to compress the pocket, to capture the precious airfields. While the Sixth Army slowly starved in Stalingrad, German High Command organized a relief operation. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most capable commanders, was given command of the newly formed Army Group Dawn with orders to break through to Stalingrad and re-establish a corridor to the trapped forces. Manstein assembled what forces he could, including the 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth. The plan, Operation Winter Storm, called for a rapid thrust northeast from positions south of the pocket to reach the 6th Army. The operation launched on December 12, 1942. Initially, it made good progress. German panzer divisions pushed forward, fighting through Soviet defensive positions. By December 19th, German spearheads had reached the Mishkova River, just 30 miles from the Stalingrad pocket. 30 miles. So close. Manstein sent messages to Paulus urging him to break out to meet the relief force. The plan called for the 6th Army to attack southwest while Manstein's forces pushed northeast. Together, they might break through the Soviet forces between them. But Paulus refused. He still had Hitler's order to hold his positions. Breaking out would mean abandoning Stalingrad, and Hitler had forbidden this. Paulus would not disobey. There were practical considerations as well. The 6th Army was now much weaker than it had been in November. Men were sick, starving, and frostbitten. Vehicles were immobilized for lack of fuel. The Army's combat power had declined dramatically. Paulus genuinely feared that attempting to break out might lead to the complete disintegration of his force. But fundamentally, it came back to Hitler's order. Stand fast. No retreat. While Paulus hesitated, the Soviets reacted. They launched fresh attacks against Manstein's relief force, and on December 24th, Operation Winter Storm was halted. The German spearheads began to fall back. The closest the relief force ever got was 30 miles from the pocket, and then it retreated, and the gap widened once more. This was the last real chance for the 6th Army to escape. After December 1942, the possibility of relief or breakout disappeared completely. January 1943 was the final chapter of the 6th Army's agony. On January 10th, the Soviets launched Operation Ring, the final offensive to eliminate the Stalingrad pocket. Massive artillery barges preceded waves of Soviet infantry and armor. The pocket began to shrink rapidly. The Potomnik airfield fell on January 16th, cutting the already minimal air supply even further. Gumrak, the last airfield, fell on January 25th. Now, supplies could only be dropped by parachute, and most went astray or fell in Soviet-controlled areas. Inside the pocket, conditions had become apocalyptic. Soldiers were eating horses, then rats, then leather from their boots. Thousands died every day from starvation, disease, and cold even before Soviet attacks. The pocket split in two, then into smaller fragments as Soviet forces compressed the defenders. The pocket split in two, then into smaller fragments as Soviet forces compressed the defenders. On January 30th, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal. The implication was clear: no German field marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler expected Paulus to fight to the death or commit suicide. But Paulus, watching his men die around him for a lost cause, had finally had enough of Hitler's orders. On January 31st, 1943, Paulus surrendered the southern pocket to the Soviets. The northern pocket held out for 2 more days before also surrendering on February 2nd. Of the approximately 290,000 men trapped in the Stalingrad pocket, only about 90,000 survived to become prisoners. And of those prisoners, fewer than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest died in Soviet captivity from disease, starvation, and brutal conditions. The German Sixth Army, one of the Wehrmacht's finest formations, had been completely destroyed. The destruction of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad was a turning point in World War II. It was the first major German defeat on this scale, and it shattered the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility. After Stalingrad, Germany would never again launch a major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. But it didn't have to happen this way. If Hitler had allowed Paulus to break out in late November 1942, much of the Sixth Army could have escaped. Yes, heavy equipment would have been lost. Yes, Stalingrad would have been abandoned. But the army itself, its experienced soldiers and officers, could have been preserved to fight another day. One order destroyed an entire army. For words, stand fast, no retreat, sealed the fate of 300,000 men. It's a stark reminder of how leadership decisions, especially those driven by ideology rather than military reality, can have catastrophic consequences. Hitler's refusal to allow tactical flexibility, his obsession with holding ground at all costs, and his willingness to believe Göring's impossible promises all combined to create one of the greatest military disasters in history. The ruins of Stalingrad would become a graveyard for German ambitions in the East, all because one man refused to give the order to retreat when retreat was still possible. Thank you for watching.